I mean, in the sense that we have, you know, a tabloid press and also what you might call a quality broadsheet press, certainly. And the same would be true across the other media as well, radio and television.
Right.
There's no doubt about that. And the most populist media would not be terribly interested in the Leveson inquiry.
But the example, and I can think of several of them, where British Prime Ministers have found their international press conferences dominated by, as you say, some sort of tittle-tattle in the...
Oh, yes. Yes, that certainly happens in Australia.
That has happened.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Australian visiting elsewhere, they get taken over by the local press. Yes,
our own Prime Minister, current Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who's done, you know, quite a lot of international diplomatic travel since her election, has been dogged by all sorts of domestic questions from the Australian press pack following her that would be of little or no interest at all to her hosts.
In another country, yeah, right. And do you see this? Do you see this reflected elsewhere? The reason I'm asking is, I'm just wondering how unique we are in this, and whether this is actually international.
Yeah, I think it's important to say, that the media from Australia who follow a Prime Minister abroad are often not always foreign correspondents, in the sense that they're not necessarily reporting her activities. They're reporting very much with a domestic audience in mind.
Right,
yeah.
okay. I'm sorry, but is it going to be more of a... Is it going to be a fair spread of the media, or is it going to be biased towards a sort of a more, dare I say it, tabloid rather than a quality end, or is it going to be an even...
Mix.
It will be mixed, yeah. Okay.
I think in terms of quality, the Indian media has been slipping steadily downwards. And that's partly because of the very intense competition there is. Anybody in the news space feels the need to be very populist. And they interpret populism as, I mean, not only in terms of content, they cover a lot of crime, cricket, cinema, celebrity. The recent big one is corruption. You know, corruption is a big issue that every news organization wants to go after. They also cover a lot of scandal, sleaze, and sex. These are very staple diets. The whole tone of all the television channels, barring one or two, is very shrill, sensationalist, lots of red banners, lots of breaking news flashes, and so on. The newspapers, even the so-called quality broadsheet newspapers, have moved down market. The Times of India, which claims to be the largest circulated English daily in the world, is full of celebrity-oriented news and cricket-oriented news. Very little attention is paid to substantive coverage. And the television channels in the last year and a half have been running a lot of sex videos. These are mainstream news television channels. Sex videos with a minimal amount of blurring, sex videos of an octogenarian chief minister with 2 women, God-man with an actress, the Congress party's, the ruling party's spokesman with a lawyer, and you know, so there are sex videos on television.
Right, that's something I hadn't thought of. Richard Desmond hasn't tried that on.
Indeed, I was just about to say, don't tell Richard Desmond.
Yeah. James, where is James in the audience? Yeah, where is he? There. I was going to ask you, so you still some knowledge of Russia. I was going to ask you, was there an interest there, or and again, a very different. I mean, again, a very different press structure. Anne, do you
Well,
want
I certainly don't think in Australia it's viewed as simply for show. On the other hand, those who take an interest in such things would be aware that there have been multiple inquiries in both our countries into regulation of the media and the conduct of the media, and usually triggered by some particularly egregious piece of behaviour. And the findings are handed down, and generally speaking what happens is the press nod and say, yes, take that on board, and nothing happens. So if there is to be real change, then the only way I think that people would believe it would happen would be if it did involve some kind of statutory backup, at least, to a beefed up self-regulatory body, which is essentially what our internal inquiry in Australia has recommended.
So do you think this might actually be enough to sort of push it over the edge in terms of actually bringing in a regulatory body?
I think if Leveson's findings were to have been delivered a bit earlier than they're due to, then it could have had a direct influence. In practice, unless the government is successfully able to sort of delay until that happens, there have now been two reports, not only the Finkelstein inquiry, which was directly into media, press regulation, media regulation, but also a convergence review, which has made its own recommendations for changes in media regulatory policy, which have been greeted with a degree of relief by the media, because it really just supports a kind of strengthened self-regulatory approach.
Sachi, do you think it can influence?
I think over the past 4 years, since the end of 2008, there's been a huge momentum building for better standards and more ethical practices in the media. And it's difficult to say how it will go, because the news media resist any talk of regulation as vociferously as they do in this country. There's talk of gagging the press, there's talk of shooting the messenger, and censorship, and so on. But so it's very difficult to predict which way this tussle will go. But there have been a lot of separate, quite distinct moves to enforce better practices in the media, or to induce the media to adopt better practices. And that's, I think the Leveson inquiry will be at least considered as a model for an investigation to look at practices and so on. And depends on what the report says, depends on the regulatory structure that emerges, if at all one emerges from this. Because if a regulatory structure emerged, I'm pretty sure it would enter the discourse at least as a model in India.
Right. And one of the points that came up in the discussion earlier this morning was this question of newsroom culture, and the idea that newsroom culture is what sort of bred the situation we're in. Do you think, is there evidence of that, do you think? I mean, so with you, this one, is it?
Absolutely. I think there are practically no studies on the Indian media or Indian newsroom cultures, but from anecdotal evidence and from talking to my friends in the media, I can say that the culture is the most crass that you can come across.
Right.
It is.
That's worth tweeting.
It's very disturbing.
Do you know any good examples of crass newsroom culture?
I think the man you want to talk to is Rich Peppiatt, actually, from who was a casual desk guy on the Daily Star, who famously resigned and sent his letter of resignation to the Guardian, and who can tell some hair-raising stories of what could only be described as a crass culture.
Sorry, in Australia, is it again a culture thing?
Oh yes, and newsroom culture varies very much from newsroom to newsroom, and from outlet to outlet. So that in broadcast media, the ABC, as the BBC, has a set of editorial policies that's fairly vigorously drummed into employees of the organisation, and is meant to guide pretty well everything they do. I mean, mistakes happen, of course. But the Fairfax media rather, triumphantly announced a new set of editorial policies a couple of years ago, an academic colleague did a follow-up study across some of their more remote outlets and discovered that many of the journalists working in country papers particularly, but also some of the city papers owned by Fairfax, had heard about the new Code of Ethics and Code of Practice, but actually had either never read it or had never been given a copy. So the dissemination of these things varies, but the existence makes a difference, I think.
The ABC, I'm just sort of going back to the point we were asking about Leveson and its influence, or not, globally. I'm curious, are the ABC guidelines modelled on those of the BBC? I mean,
I would imagine they're very close, yes. I mean, I think they are, having read them both. I think they are. The Australian ones have been developed independently, but that are based around the same principles. Yeah.
Right. My other question was, we were talking earlier about the Australian, you mentioned Rupert Murdoch setting this up. And this is, I mean, I'm not wanting to sort of say too nice things about Mr. Murdoch, but I'm just the point being that he did actually set up what was the first national newspaper. He did, and very proudly. And he supported it for over 10 years as a loss. He lost millions of dollars on it, and he's continued to support it, despite it barely breaking even now, really. And in fact, if you look at the circulation of the Australian in comparison to that of the major city newspapers, including his own, because in some cities Murdoch has a monopoly of newspapers. It's relatively small, but partly because it's national and because it has quite a good foreign bureau as well, overseas bureau, it's a very influential paper. It's read by opinion leaders, it's read by politicians, certainly by business executives, and I mean, obviously academics and so on. So even people who don't agree with its politics will tend to read it because they'll want to know what it's saying. Big sales in Canberra.
Yes, big sales in Canberra.
Okay.
That's right.
I want to move on now. We're going to talk a bit more. We've talked about sort of its influence otherwise. Just want to talk a bit about current regulation. Although such, from what you're saying, doesn't sound as though there's a lot in India.
You're absolutely right. There's practically no regulation. It goes by the name of self-regulation.
Can you stop talking now, or are you going to... No, sorry. Carry on, please.
It goes by the name of self-regulation,
right?
But in practical terms, there is no regulation. The newspapers are governed by the Press Council of India, not governed. The self-regulatory body for the newspapers is called the Press Council of India, which was set up in 1978. It is often called a toothless body. It has no powers to impose any punishment or penalty upon any newspapers for any infringements. It's the television news industry is not regulated at all. They have a self-regulatory body set up at the end of 2008 called the News Broadcasters Association, which is basically a body of CEO and Chief Operating Officer level. Soon after that, they set up the Broadcast Editors Association. But these bodies act more as lobbies for the industry rather than as self-regulatory authorities of any kind.